Loki and her puppies were heartlessly thrown out of a car, left stranded in the cold night. Imagine the hopelessness of a mother abandoned, struggling to survive with her newborns in the freezing weather, when hope seems to have run out. But then, something unexpected happens, a fateful encounter. Who appeared that night, and how did this meeting change everything? Join us now to follow this emotional and surprising story. On a December night, the air was so bitterly cold it stung the skin, and Willowbrook Park was shrouded in a misty snow, white and silent. The ground was frozen, and the bare branches reached up to the sky like brittle, broken sticks. The light from the street lamps was faint, barely illuminating the dense darkness, creating a quiet, desolate space. The dark clouds hung low, as if they were hiding a snowstorm about to arrive. Suddenly, the peace was shattered by the roar of an engine as a car sped down the street, the sound of tires skidding over the snow-covered road, the engine's loud growl, and then the car abruptly slowed. The rear doors swung open, and no one could have predicted that, in that moment, the lives of these tiny creatures would be forever changed. With a harsh, violent motion, their previous owner, a man devoid of any mercy, threw the 5 puppies out one by one. Each one was tossed out like an inanimate object, without any love or care. They were hurled into the freezing snow with such force that their small bodies collided violently with the frozen ground, causing them excruciating pain. In that moment, they couldn't understand why they were treated this way. They were just tiny creatures, mere beings with the instinct to survive, and now they were abandoned in panic, fear, and pain. The puppies rolled in the snow, their bodies stiff with cold, their limbs paralyzed. Each fall, each toss, felt like the entire world was crumbling around them. They couldn't understand why they were enduring such pain. They didn't know why they were abandoned and discarded like worthless things. Shivering, unable to stand, they only knew to claw at the cold snow in search of warmth. But no one answered. Loki, the unfortunate mother dog, stood frozen, her heart aching with sorrow. Her eyes were filled with worry and despair as she looked at her motionless puppies lying on the snow, their tiny bodies trembling in the bone-chilling cold. Loki could only rush to them, trying to gather them into her embrace, covering them with her warm body, protecting them from the biting cold. But sometimes, a mother's instincts are not strong enough to stop the pain. Loki licked each of her puppies, trying to warm them with gentle licks, but the cold and panic from her helpless little ones couldn't chase away the despair in her heart. Each gentle lick failed to soothe the physical and emotional pain they were enduring. The puppies couldn't understand that their mother, too, was just a small creature, powerless against the cruelty of the world outside. From the wounds caused by the brutal toss to the pain of the freezing cold, all they could do was huddle together in their mother's warmth, seeking comfort and solace, not knowing if they could survive the freezing night. At the far end of the park, a lone figure appeared through the misty night. It was Madison Thompson, a 65-year-old woman, walking slowly but steadily, her gray coat swaying in the cold wind. Just 5 months ago, she had walked down this path with her husband, Jack, sharing smiles and small talk. But now, she was alone, and those walks had become a monotonous habit, the only connection between her and the distant memories of happier times. Witnessing the brutal sight of the abandoned puppies and the freezing cold, Madison could not stand still. As she stepped closer to the group of small dogs, she could feel the fear and tension in every movement of Loki. The mother dog's eyes, filled with suspicion and worry, never left her, as if she could not bring herself to trust the kindness of a stranger after everything they had been through. Loki took a step back as Madison reached out toward her. Her ears pricked up, and the puppies huddled together, too scared to leave their mother. Madison paused for a moment, gazing into those fearful eyes, and whispered softly, "Don't worry, I won't hurt you." Gently, she extended her hand and stroked Loki's fluffy fur. She could feel the tension in Loki's body, but something in Madison's tenderness seemed to ease her fear. After a moment of hesitation, the determination in Madison's eyes calmed Loki, and finally, Loki decided to follow her home. "Come with me," Madison said, her voice thick with emotion. "I have a warm place for you and your babies." Carefully, she removed the blue scarf her late husband had given her, gently rolling it up into a makeshift basket. Miraculously, Loki did not resist, allowing her to lift each puppy gently and place them into the warm scarf. Each little pup, their eyes wide with confusion, was tenderly caressed by Madison, who whispered comforting words as she placed them into the soft fabric. Finally, she reached out her hand to Loki. The dog's mother stared at her for a long time, then looked at her pups. It seemed as though a decision had been made in her heart, and slowly she stood up, limping toward Madison. "Let's go home," Madison said, her words warm and firm. The word home, once spoken with Jack during cozy evenings, now took on a new meaning. Under the thickening snow, the 5 tiny lives and the lonely woman walked together, beginning a journey they could never have expected. Madison walked down the familiar path beside Loki and the puppies. Her heart sensed a miraculous change. It felt as though God had sent her a gift, a new reason to wake up each morning, a reason to no longer be lonely. These small creatures, though they could never replace Jack, had become companions she would care for, look after, and love as family. Every time she bent down to stroke them, her heart fluttered with simple but sincere joy. To be loved and to give love, this was what she needed now, and God had brought it to her at the moment of her deepest despair. When Madison and Loki, along with the puppies, arrived home, it felt as if she had brought back an important piece of her lost life. The small house, though simple, now felt warmer and more lively than ever, thanks to the presence of these tiny beings. She opened the door and let them enter, immediately feeling the warmth from the fire that banished the cold from the outside. Madison hurriedly prepared food for Loki and the puppies. She took a bowl of warm food from the cupboard and placed it at Loki's feet, then brought warm water for the puppies. Though still somewhat hesitant and fearful, Loki slowly began to enjoy her meal. Madison watched them with a gentle gaze, her heart filled with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. After the puppies had eaten their fill, she turned on the heater in the house to make the air even warmer. She quietly observed each puppy lying still on the rug, their eyes sparkling with exhaustion. But what warmed her heart was the closeness and gratitude in their every glance. But she knew that the puppies needed more than that. She spent the whole night trying to create warm sleeping spots for them. She took the old blankets of her husband, soft fabrics to line the floor, and placed the little beds next to each other, making sure they would feel safe and warm. She did everything in silence. Only the occasional sound of the needle tearing through the fabric and breaking the stillness. That night, Mrs. Madison felt like she had found a part of herself that she had lost. The feeling of caring for and protecting a living being, whether a dog or a person, always brought a deep happiness that only a loving heart could understand. The small house no longer felt like a place where she was alone. It was now filled with the gentle breathing of the puppies, peacefully sleeping, and even her heart, gradually healing from the pain of losing her loved one. A few days later, on a night when the snowstorm raged outside, Mrs. Madison's small house suddenly fell into darkness. The heating system had broken, and the warmth that once filled that cozy space seemed to vanish in an instant. Mrs. Madison looked around, feeling the cold not only seep into the air but also into her heart, as she realized she was facing yet another challenge. Tonight, she wasn't only worried about herself, she also had to protect the puppies she had taken in as her family. She fumbled with the repair kit, but the snow kept falling, burying the house in a thick white layer. The storm intensified, and the cold seemed to seep into every corner of the house. Suddenly, she heard a faint bark echoing through the stillness. She hurried outside but wasn't prepared for what awaited her. One of the puppies, Max, the smallest and weakest of the litter, had fallen into a deep hole in the yard, where snow and broken pieces of wood had collapsed after the storm swept through. Max whimpered weakly, lying trapped beneath the cold debris. Madison felt panic rising, her heart racing as she saw Max trapped under the rubble. She had to act quickly. Time was passing by, and every minute made the situation worse. She knew that if she didn't rescue Max right now, it might not survive this dreadful snowstorm. She rushed over, but the heavy snow and wood made it difficult, forcing her to work twice as hard to dig. Everything blurred as she fought against the power of the storm and the weakness of her own body. The snow kept falling thicker, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of her coat. When Madison bent down to dig through the snow and wood to rescue Max, an unexpected slip caused her to fall into the deep hole along with the little dog. The biting cold and weight of the snow and debris surrounding her made it hard to breathe, and her body wavered, as though it no longer had the strength to rise. Loki, seeing Madison fall, immediately barked loudly, the sound echoing through the still space, full of worry and fear. Running back and forth, Loki kept calling out, the desperate bark seeming like cries for help, as if hoping Madison could stand up. Mrs. Madison felt pain, her heart pounding as if it might burst in her chest. The tightening in her chest, something she had lived with for years, now returned, stronger and more dangerous than ever. Her weak heartbeat seemed insufficient to keep her alive in this situation. Every breath became harder, and she could feel her life slowly slipping away as if each passing second was a race against death. She struggled to stay calm, but her body refused to cooperate. Loki, seeing her struggle, grew even more frantic. It rushed to her, curling beside her, unable to understand why the one it loved was in this state. Loki barked louder again, as if trying to pull her out of this cold hole. Mrs. Madison could feel the fragility of life, both hers and the puppies that she had promised to protect. Her heart beat faintly, and each pulse seemed like a prayer. She knew that without timely help, she wouldn't survive this critical moment.
Oh my God.
Amid the fierce snowstorm, Loki stood still for a moment, its eyes gleaming with determination. There was no time to hesitate. It turned and ran with all its might, its small legs charging through the thick snow, barely able to see anything but a white blur. But in its heart, there was only one goal: to save Madison, the mother it had come to love and depend on for so long. With urgent steps, Loki headed toward the neighbor's house, the one Mrs. Madison had turned to for help when needed. Despite the cold winds and thick snow, Loki never slowed down, focused only on the warm house of the neighbors. He had reached the window, tapping its front paws against the wall, its eyes looking up as if pleading for help. The people inside immediately understood Loki's message, opening the door and running after it. The storm didn't deter them, and when they arrived, the scene left them stunned. Mrs. Madison was lying motionless in a hole, thick snow covering her body. Her entire body was limp, her eyes tightly shut, and her heart beat faint. Without wasting any time, they immediately called an ambulance and tried to administer first aid while waiting for help. Saving Mrs. Madison was a miracle, and they couldn't stop thanking Loki, the dog who had guided them and saved her life. When the ambulance arrived, Mrs. Madison was taken away, and the doctors quickly took all necessary measures to save her. Loki stood from a distance, his eyes full of concern, unable to take his gaze off Mrs. Madison, as if he sensed the danger. But as the ambulance drove away, Loki felt a sense of relief, knowing that Mrs. Madison would be okay. A few days after being discharged from the hospital, Mrs. Madison returned to her little house, still weak but filled with joy because of the dogs living with her. Especially Loki, the loyal companion who had been by her side, helping her through difficult times. However, this joy didn't last long. One morning, as she was preparing breakfast, there was a loud knock at the door. When she opened it, a rough man stood before her, his gaze menacing. He was the former owner of the dogs. "Give me my dogs back," he shouted impatiently. "They're mine, and I won't let you keep them." Mrs. Madison was startled, her heart filled with worry. "They're mine now," she replied firmly. "They're not your property to throw away and take back whenever you want." The man's eyes narrowed, his anger rising. "You have no right to keep them. I'll call the police. You don't know anything." Mrs. Madison tried to stay calm, but a sense of unease spread through her. The dogs were an important part of her life, and she couldn't let them be taken away. As soon as the man called the police, she felt as though the entire world was against her. However, she didn't know that she wasn't alone. The police arrived shortly afterward, but the man didn't realize that Mrs. Madison had witnessed the entire scene when he ruthlessly tossed the dogs out of his car as he passed through the park that night. She remembered that moment clearly, and what was surprising was that the nearby CCTV had recorded his cruel behavior. As the police reviewed the evidence, the man's face turned pale at the undeniable truth. "We won't let this animal abuse go unpunished," an officer said as they approached the man. In the end, Mrs. Madison was granted custody of the 5 dogs she had loved and cared for. As for the man, his cruel actions led to his arrest, and he was held accountable for his behavior. Once again, his violence and cruelty had placed him in an unforeseeable situation. Time passed, and the hardships were behind them. When the puppies grew big and healthy, Mrs. Madison began preparing them for a new life. With the help of the local veterinary clinic, she carefully planned to find them families that would truly love them. Each morning, she took the dogs to the clinic for checkups and vaccinations, and to ensure they would be welcomed into the best possible conditions. The adoption process was not easy, but Mrs. Madison was meticulous, only choosing families who genuinely loved animals. She met and thoroughly discussed with potential adopters, ensuring that each dog would have a happy and safe life. The puppies, with their gentle and lovable nature, quickly found new homes. Some were adopted by families with children, where they became joyful companions for the kids. Others were taken in by animal lovers who were ready for a new life with the little dogs. Throughout this process, Mrs. Madison felt an unusual joy. Even though she had to part with the puppies, she knew they would have better lives, and that comforted her. However, there were two dogs she couldn't let go. Loki, the resilient mother, had become her closest friend. She couldn't imagine life without Loki by her side. Along with Max, the smallest dog in the litter, Mrs. Madison felt happiness knowing they would stay with her and never to leave. Day by day, her home became warmer than ever. Loki and Max walked with her during quiet mornings, and the laughter in the little house was like a symphony of happiness. The story of the 5 members of Loki the dog's family is a vivid testament to the immense power of love and compassion. From the early days, when Mrs. Madison decided to care for and protect the poor abandoned dogs, to the moment she opened her heart to find homes for them. This journey not only changed her life, but also spread waves of kindness and empathy throughout the community around her. Loki, with her boundless maternal love, along with the 4 tiny puppies, gave Mrs. Madison a renewed sense of purpose, allowing her to feel the love and connection she had long been missing. Loki's sacrifice, Mrs. Madison's patience, and the love they shared with each other became a source of inspiration for those around them. The community not only witnessed the bond between humans and animals, but also felt the importance of treating all living beings with kindness, no matter who they are.